This morning during the CWNP update, I just briefly mentioned to you that we might see some things coming into the Wi-Fi track next year related to automation. Well, the reason for that is it's a very big and important part of things moving forward. So we have to make absolutely sure that the people have the knowledge that they need in order to address automation issues if they become important in their environments. Well, we have one of the best people that we could have talking about automation with us here today, Jake Snyder. And he's going to talk to you about automation and how it might be different than you think, but how it's very important for our environments today.
All right, everyone, welcome to Automation for the Rest of Us. I am Jake Snyder. I'm a corporate SE at Juniper, working with Mist. I'm also a CWNE and a Board of Advisor member, and I hold a number of wireless certifications as I've been doing this for about 11 years. So I'm also a programmer of sorts. I write Python, and I have an objective of learning Go. But this talk isn't about Python. It is about not writing code and still doing some automation. That said, I really want to kind of make sure you guys are aware that the future is written by software developers. Not learning and using a language is going to put you at a huge disadvantage. That said, there's a lot of stuff we can do without writing software, and that everything's going to be okay. So ditch diggers have been around forever. And one of the things that's great about digging ditches is that it is about as manual process as you can get. It's been happening this way for hundreds of years. But that said, automation doesn't necessarily happen because everything is great. It happens because there are efficiencies we can get. And well, digging ditches goes a lot easier and faster than what we used to do because of equipment like this. Now, that's not to say that digging ditches by hand doesn't happen. It still does. But in places where automations like this don't make sense. Now, why are we talking about ditch digging? Because I like ditch digging and manual labor because it illustrates a point. That job doesn't go away. That work still needs to be done. It just isn't necessarily done in the same manual way that we've historically done it. Now, when we talk about automation and all of these things that are happening in our industry, AI and ML, automation, even things that are happening at the regulatory level, like Wi-Fi 6E, these are all things that have the potential to disrupt the work that you do or the services that you're selling as a business. And there are things at risk. Just remember that the goal is not to replace what you do. It's to make sure you're doing the most valuable work you can be doing. Is that digging with a shovel or digging with a backhoe? I'll leave that to you. So what kinds of things can we do to elevate our skill sets so that we are doing more valuable work? Obviously, the first one is learn a programming language. Big caveat, everything we're going to talk about today, it's easier if you can program a language. Now, depending on which language may depend on which tools are easier or harder. For example, I think almost everything that we're going to show today is going to have JavaScript in it, not Python. And so if you know how to write some JavaScript, things can get easier. You can do more. But that's not a requirement to use some of the tools we're going to talk about. But everything we're going to talk about is easier with some programming language behind you. So other things that we can do, learn how to pass data between systems. Understanding APIs. How do I take and once I have that data in a good format, how do I get it to an API? Also learning some systems that are basically there to glue APIs together. And then finally, there's some automation frameworks you can leverage as well, like Ansible and Terraform. Those are outside the topic of discussion today, but but those are there as well and are great ways to start without necessarily learning a programming language. So what are data interchange formats? You probably know some already. Things like CSV are a way to exchange data between systems. But we're going to talk about some that are a little more flexible than CSV. JSON and YAML are probably the things you're going to run into the most. If you're doing things with a lot of DevOps tools like Ansible, they're going to understand YAML files. And yet most APIs speak JSON. Why the difference? Well, they both have very similar goals. These both represent the same data. But what the difference is that JSON has the priority of being easy to parse from a machine perspective. So the goal of JSON is to make it very easy to extract and parse the data out of these systems. So it uses a lot of very formal syntax like quotes and colons and brackets and commas of that nature. Now, while that is great, me as a human, I struggle with that. I'm always forgetting extra commas. I'm always missing commas. I'm copying and pasting. I'm missing closing quotes. So there are some things there that become a little like tedious for humans to deal with. YAML has very similar constraints, except it's meant to be more easily to be human writable, and there's much less syntax involved. It's more indent based, meaning that because I indent something further than something else, that means it belongs under it. And so you can represent the same types of data in JSON and YAML. It's just one is a lot easier for humans to write without a lot of syntax, and one is much easier for systems to parse. XML is another one. And you guys will forgive me, my dog is going crazy over here. XML is still more verbose. It definitely gives us a little more flexibility in terms of data type. But it is a lot more verbose. There is a lot more syntax. And because of that, it is even more difficult to be human writable without some sort of tooling. And unfortunately for us, most of those toolings happen around programming languages. So we're going to focus on JSON for today. Just understand that you can represent that data in multiple formats, and you need to look at your API and figure out what you need. Now, in terms of APIs, there's a bunch of types of APIs. There are APIs that use HTTP as the protocol. There's APIs that use SSH as the transport protocol, or gRPC using protocol buffers. We're going to focus on REST today. It's simple. It's HTTP based. And it gives you a lot of flexibility. It doesn't restrict you to one particular type of data interchange format. So you can use JSON or XML, and there's the only thing that really governs that is the thing at the other end. We have verbs in REST. It typically describes what type of action you want you're going to perform. So if you say a get is going to retrieve data from a system about an object. Post is going to create an object, put updates, patch updates, and then delete obviously deletes an object. We also have what we call the URI. The URI is basically the URL, and typically there's some meanings in the URI in terms of like what some of this stuff means. So we will see a version ID, we'll see a collection, which is like if I want to get a list of all the sites, I would go to the sites collection and get that data. If I wanted to get details about a particular site, I would obviously ask about that specific site. So the the URI is going to have a bunch of information you can use to kind of navigate your way through an API. We're also adding stuff to the end. You can do filters and queries. Obviously, these are going to be based on the API you're connecting to. And so because of that, you're going to actually you have to read the documentation to find what you can filter on. If you try to use something in this that they don't support, it doesn't work. So when we make a request, we're going to put a bunch of things together. We're going to start with our verb. What am I going to do? I'm going to get. I'm going to go to a URI that has an endpoint specific to something I want. In this case, it's going to be details about myself. I'm going to pass in some headers. Typically, there's not a ton you need, but I need to kind of ask for what I want. And I also, in this case, need to authenticate myself. And so I'm going to pass an authorization token with my API token. I'm also going to specify that I want application JSON, which means I want it to return me the data in a format of JSON. And then if I was doing something other than a get, like a put or a post, I may also have to put a payload or a body together to send up. Right? So if I was going to create a site, I might have to pass details of that site in JSON format up. And then consequently on the response, we're going to get a status code. And these are HTTP status codes. Was I successful or not? What was there an error or not? And then I'm going to get some more headers back about the response. In this case, it's telling me how long or what the application type. And then finally, the data that I asked for. It's going to pass me data about my account. So when we start talking about tools, how do I interact with these APIs? How do I start learning? Step one is read the documentation. It's super important. All these APIs are different. Even just subtly, they're different. Read the docs to determine how to actually talk to the API you're interested in. The second one is how do I actually make those calls? We can make those calls typically using some built-in tools. A couple examples of those built-in tools are things like Swagger and Django. Swagger is just an interactive, we'll get into that, but we also have curl, which is a CLI tool, and then we have some UI apps like Postman or HTTP bot. Okay, Swagger is built-in interactive API documentation. It allows you to publish the documentation while also providing a framework through which you can actually make the calls directly. And you can see an example here where there's an API call, which is a get. It gives us some boxes and fields to pick options. And there's actually a button to go run that call, and you can see the operation was successful and return some data. There is, so I work for Mist, and we use Django as our interactive API tool. Django is actually what provides our API and also gives you some boxes to be able to, interact with the API. You do have to put the URL or the URI for the call you want in, and then it will allow you to perform operations at that level. So curl is a CLI tool because everyone loves a command line tool. It gives you the options that we've seen before where we can specify our verb, our headers, our payload. It also gives you the opportunity to pipe some of that output to other tools like JQ in this instance. Just makes it look pretty. It's going to colorize and indent my JSON. So just makes things nicer to consume. Postman is probably the gold standard for a UI app to make an API call. It started as a Chrome plugin and has evolved from there. But the general idea is you pick your verb, your URI, fill in whatever headers or body you need and click send. And it spits you back the response. And it has a bunch of built-in tools that make it nice to work with. All right, we have Postman open, and we're going to start by making a simple request. So we're going to create a request, and the first thing we need to do is pick a verb. We'll leave it a get because we're just going to get information, and we're going to pick a URL or URI that is relatively easy to go to, which is this is the API v1 self. In fact, I'm going to make this a little bigger so you guys can see it easily. And we're going to just run this as is. And you'll notice I get an error. I got an arrow 401 unauthorized because I didn't provide any authentication credentials. Now, I could go in and just do this. Grab my API token, paste this in. And now if I hit send, you'll notice that it returns details about me. You'll see I have, there's my email, first name, last name, some tags. This is how Mist keeps track of what type of user you are. I am a Mist customer in this scenario, mostly because this is my personal account. But it also gives me permissions for each org that I am a member of and what my permissions are. So now we could hard code our token into this and save it. But the problem is that it's not very scalable. I want to create other API calls that reference this token. So the first thing I would suggest we do is we create an environment which is going to have a bunch of variables in it. In this case, I've already put some variables in place, one of which is my API token. And I'm going to replace this big ugly token with API token. And this is a variable. If you mouse over it, it'll tell you that, what the value is, and the scope is environment. So this is my environment up here. And now if I run this, it does the same thing. It still returns my info. But now I can change this to do things that, to make other calls that use API token. So now I don't have to put that hard coded into every call. But to go still further, I really don't want to create these at all. And to solve that, we're actually going to go over to explorer.postman.com. We'll search for Mist. You'll see there's a Mist collection. There's US and EU. We're just going to say run in Postman. And what this will do is it will actually import a pre-built collection into Postman. Now, once we have that collection in Postman, we can use that very quickly and easily without a lot of work. In fact, you'll see this folder show up 533 requests. You'll find that anything, well, I shouldn't say anything, almost everything in the API is built here. This is maintained by one of the Mist SEs over in the EU. And, he's doing this manually today as a service to us, the community. So we're going to do a couple things. I'm going to edit this collection. I don't like the way Thomas necessarily does his authentication. I'm going to put it in the collection. And oops. I'm going to use that API token variable that I did. I'm also going to get rid of these. That's how he deals with some of that stuff. I don't like it to be set that way. So just for me personally, now if I go in, and I'm going to close this one that I built, but if I go into authentication self, get self, this is the same call using some environment variables I've defined. So I've defined my host as api.mist.com. And now if I hit send, you'll see it returns me the results. But the cool part about that is I don't have to actually do a ton. So I were to come in here and say, here's the org I'm interested in. I can actually right click and say set org ID. Why? Because I have an org ID inside my environment. So now since I have an org ID, I could go in and say I want to do something like get org inventory. And you'll see the org ID variable here maps to this org ID path parameter, which is this. And so without doing much, I was able to get details about my inventory. So let's pick this AP. If I highlight this, oh, I don't have device ID, but I can come up here and create device ID. And I can literally just right click this, say set device ID. And now if I wanted to go say, actually I probably need the site ID too, which is one of the reasons I like org inventory, because I get both org and site and device ID all in the same place. Now, if I were to come up here and go to devices, and I were to say get site devices, this would show all the devices for this particular site. And so if I was interested in a specific device, I could actually say, do something like get site device config. You'll notice device ID, I set that from the org inventory. Now we can look at the config for my particular AP. Pretty cool. So the power of Postman is to be able to pull down these things. I can make these API calls. I have full control over the parameters and the headers. I can actually like update something. Like if I was to update a device, you'll notice that like the body, I can just say if I wanted to rename this device, I can just change that. I can also go back to my like name, since my device ID, and if I said I wanted to update the site device, I could literally say _1, and it would come back and it would say, oh, your name is guest bedroom AP43 _1. And if I were to go check the Mist dashboard, it would also reflect that that name had been updated. So instead of having to figure a lot of this out, he's also done a good job of keeping these somewhat consistent. Some of them are going to have documentation up here. Some of them won't. It just depends where he's at. He's constantly updating it. But it gives us the ability to very quickly and easily use APIs without, I didn't write any programming to do this, right? It's very quick, very easy. And because all those are variables, they get longer as time goes by. Like when we get to webhooks, get site webhooks, this takes site ID as the variable. So here's my webhooks. If I wanted to get a specific webhook, I would say, okay, this is a webhook ID. I would say set webhook ID. And then I wanted to get the details for that particular webhook. You can see that here's the details for my StackStorm webhook. Pretty cool. All right. Now what? Okay, we know how to make a JSON payload. We know how to make an API call. We know how webhooks work. What do we do with that, right? Where's the value? The value is in some of these automation frameworks. So let's talk about Postman. We've talked about Postman. Postman Runner is a component of Postman. There's also a CLI component to this as well, if you want, but it allows you to chain multiple API calls in order. And what this allows you to do is to take something like a CSV or a JSON file and say, iterate through this file. And for every line in this CSV file, I want you to go make these 10 API calls. And so you can say, well, hey, Jake, I want you to create 500 sites. Here's a CSV with 500 entries. All the data you need is in them. Just go through and do that. That's kind of the advantage of using Postman because you're building out or you're getting a collection with all of those API endpoints already built, and then you can drag and drop them in order to automate tasks. Now, this is great for bulk operations, but what I want to talk to you about is the need for some JavaScript. We talked about you don't need to be able to program. So one of the things that we're going to show is the Mist Runner collection that I've been building. And the goal for there is you not to need anything. But if you want to build those yourself or for your team, I had to struggle through a lot of JavaScript because that's what Postman uses for its scripting engine. And so like you don't need to be able to write code, but it can actually make some of these automations a lot easier. So just keep that in mind that all the stuff I'm going to show is published publicly, but it's something I had to write a lot of code to get there. So let's jump into that demo. Okay. So what we're going to do is now one thing I've done since I've also gone in and added a Google API token. So if we look at this first one, I need a Google API key. So I've gone and put that in. I don't want you guys to see it because it's mine and it costs money for people to use it. So I'm not going to show that to you, but I did have to go sign up for a developer account. They do give you a credit every month. So unless you're creating hundreds of thousands of sites, it probably isn't a big deal, but it is something I did have to do in addition to the Mist call, which is just this one here. Actually, these two. So if we go to Runner, I want to make sure I clear out. we're going to go into the Mist runner collection. We're going to say site creation. It's going to run these 4. I'm going to pick my wireless technology forum environment, and then I'm going to pick example sites. If we look at this, this is 4 sites. These are state capitals, state capitol buildings. And I'm just going to uncheck. I just want to save the responses so I can look at them with you. And what we're going to do is run this. Now, first, we're going to verify that I don't have these sites created. And if you look, I have 2 sites, one named Washington, which is designed to fail because I already have a site. And the other one is my personal site. Okay. So if I come back in, we're going to run these 4. And if I hit the run button, it's going to go through, it's going to run each of these 4 API calls, and it should run them 4 times. And hopefully one of them fails, which it looks like it did. And if we go look at the run summary, you can see the first iteration, it ran all 4 tests, or all four API calls, and all of the tests were successful. We got to this last one, and this was Washington on number 4, and it said verify site name doesn't exist. It did exist. Washington did exist. So it didn't run create site. So I was actually able to do some pretty sophisticated things. And if I refresh this page, you should see that I now have my site plus Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. And if we click on these, you should see that they are, like Idaho is centered at the Boise Capitol. If I click on Oregon, it should be on the Oregon Capitol in Salem, all with just those 4 pieces of information that we used in Postman Runner, which if we go back and we look, all we had was site name and site address. And I can walk you through, this basically takes the address and just gets details about it. This gets the time zone and the country code. So the goal is that we get the country code and the time zone set in the site. We check to make sure there's no site with that name already. And assuming all of those work, we create a post to Mist that creates the site. And it's nice, it gives you a little summary so that if something didn't get created, you actually do get some feedback. So that is how you can do. Now, there's other ones in this. There's inventory assignment, AP naming. Hopefully by the time this airs, there will be some additional ones if you go download it. But the goal is to give you some automation tools that you can use without necessarily having to write any code. So you can thank my day job, Mist Systems, Juniper and the Mist team for giving me the time to actually put this together. But yeah, thank you for checking that out. Okay, now we're going to talk about a special type of API called a webhook. Now, in a typical API call, we have a client that's going to call out to something, and it's going to make a request, and we're going to get a response. But in a webhook, it's kind of the reverse of that. What it does is, this is where the request comes from the thing that you're interacting with, and it's coming to you or someplace you configure. Now, the great part about this is it can be event driven, because when something happens, like when, say, an AP goes down, it's going to send a message someplace, and I'm going to get that. Now, is it necessarily my laptop? No, not always. And there's challenges with that, because the cloud would have to have reachability to my laptop, which is not always the case. But there are things like reverse proxies, but typically these are going to systems. And it's actually even easier when those systems are also in the cloud, because now there's no there's firewall, but there's no NAT, there's nothing in there to stop the request from going through. And so this is great for event-driven stuff. If you want to think about this as like the SNMP trap equivalent for APIs. When something happens, I'm going to send a request, and that request typically is a post. I'm going to create a message at the other end saying, hey, this piece of data, this thing happened. This might be a AP going down. It might be something like someone changed a configuration on your network. Those types of things are what you would see for webhooks. And it's very good for doing things like event-driven automations, where when this thing happens, do something else. So let's go ahead and jump into a quick webhook demo so you guys can get kind of the feel for that. So we're back in Postman. I'm going to go run this again. This is getting my webhooks. I've got a webhook set up called webhook.site, and it's got a URL here. And it's already set up, basically meaning that Mist is pushing webhook events. We're going to actually make a modification to this. And what we have is, and it's actually already happening, we've got that set up to point to this site called webhook.site. And if we delete all these requests and we come in, it's going to give us a unique URL. This one happens to be mine right now. And we're going to, and I think that's the one we're using here, 7B. Yep, 7B. But we're going to tweak this. So I'm going to say we're going to modify this. So we're going to do an edit site webhook. And we're going to go into the body, and I'm going to just change the topics, and we're going to add can't type with this microphone in front of me, zone as a type of topic that we're going to subscribe to. Now, you'll notice it's yelling at me because my JSON syntax was incorrect. I'm going to send that. It should come back. Oops. It doesn't matter. But if we hop over to this thing, you're going to see a type audit. And what this means is admin Jake Snyder updated webhook ST2, which is not the one I intended to, but it's the one I did, on this org, on this site, with this site name. Here was his IP, the timestamp, etc. And so every time an event happens, Mist is going to send an HTTP post to that URL, and it's going to show up here. Now, in this case, it's just going to show me the details of that. It's not going to do anything with it, but it's going to. That's part of how webhooks work. It's going to rely on the thing at this end in order to deal with that webhook. And as those events happen, I'm going to get events. So we saw earlier was a client session. This one is an audit. If we added more topics, we would get more events. But maybe we don't want more. Sometimes we only want something very specific. Like in this case, a topic like device up downs. If I really only wanted this system to get an event when an AP went up or down, I could use just that particular topic. So that's a basic demonstration of how webhooks work and how you can get like a system to communicate updates and events to other systems. Thank you. All right, let's talk about Node-RED. So for those of you who are like, hey, Postman's cool, but I don't want to have to be running Postman in order to do stuff, or maybe I want to work on some things that are event-driven. What happens when an AP goes down, or what happens when an administrator makes a change? Node-RED is a low-code way to chain a bunch of events together. Now, when I say low-code, you can do everything. Like in this case, I have a webhook set up, and I do a switch. So if I get an audit message, I'm going to post to Teams and do take the message of what the change was and post it to Teams. Now that's cool, and it didn't require any code. But I will be honest, it would have been like 2 blocks if I was allowed to write a little Python or a little JavaScript script in order to do some work for me. Instead, I had to do some things like the message topic switch. I then had to change, and there were 3 rules in the change. But like I said, these are one of those. It's easier if you have some programming skills. But effectively, what we'll do is just take blocks of code that are, and they're basically code, but they're a block that does something. In the case of this one, the first one just takes in a webhook. And then there's a block that responds to the webhook. And there's a block that says, well, if the topic is audit, I'm going to send it to the block, and they're just connected with dots or with lines. And then I'm going to format into a message that Teams understands. And then I'm going to send a webhook post to Teams to create the message in my Teams app. It gives you lots of extensions. There's a whole community of plugins that you can get that do a lot of stuff. So you shouldn't have to write code to do some of these things. That said, like I said, it can be easier if you do write code. In this case, JavaScript or Python are both supported. JavaScript is what it's written in, so that support is natively built in. Python is something you have to go install. So let's jump in. We'll do a quick demo of Node-RED and see what that's all about. All right, let's start digging into what we can do in Node-RED. I'm going to currently build a webhook to Teams notifier. So we're gonna take a Mist webhook, and in this case it's HTTP in, and I'm gonna set up a URL for it to post to. And since Mist is going to send a post, that's what I'm going to set it up as. So that effectively says take HTTP in and do something with it. Now I need a response to let the webhook sender know that I got it. And at this point, I'm just going to take whatever we get from the webhook and pass it back. And I'm going to deploy that. That is now running. Now let's take a look at how I've set this up to actually send it. Okay. So what I've done is I'm running this on my local machine. I'm basically making a post to the URL /mist. And in here, I've taken the body of a webhook that I received earlier on webhook.site. So I've got that webhook. I've just mocked it up like this was Mist sending it. For testing, it's just going to be me. All right. And then to show that it's actually doing something, we're going to do two things. I'm going to put a debug on here, and I'm going to send a message. Now you'll notice I got a response, which it basically, whatever I put in the body, it just echoed back to me. But also in Node-RED, there's a debug dialog over here. You can find it with the little bug. And it's going to give you the ability to kind of browse through the data that was received. So now that we have like our webhook receiver working, we're going to take the and start. I have to do some data manipulation to get things into the format that that Teams wants, but I also don't want to send every message to Teams. So I'm going to use a logical switch where I'm going to take the output, I'm going to do some logic on it. So we're going to look at if the payload.topic is equal to, and since I really only want audits, if it's equal to audits, then we're going to send it to output number 1. And if it's anything else, I'm going to send it to output number 2. Okay, and this is a topic switch. Okay, so now if I were to use the bottom one and deploy and send, you'll notice I don't get another output. But if I were to take this and put it on the top, you'll see that now I get a debug. So that's part of the beauty of this. It gives you the ability to do your own interactive debugging. But we also end up with the ability to do some logical decisions. Okay, so now that I have a logical decision, I need to manipulate some data out of this. And so what I really want to do is take this data and pull some of it out, because you'll see I could have gotten multiple events, but I'm really only interested in the first event. I don't want to have to dig around in this. So we're going to say set, and I'm going to pull the things I want. So in this case, I really care about the admin name. And so I'm going to pull admin name up to the top level. And so I'm going to say reference the message, and then I'm going to say copy the path to that value. So I'm saying set the payload.admin, so this is in JSON, the admin value equal to this value here. Now we're also going to do that for a couple others. We're going to do the site name, and we'll cheat again and just copy paste. I also care about the actual message. All right. So now if I take this and we debug that, and we send it, we should see that our topic now has more. If I look at just up here, all I had for a top level was events and topic, and now we have admin, message, site name. Cool. So I pulled those values out. Now I want to actually build a template. Now, the format that Microsoft Teams needs is not the same as what we sent. It needs specific fields, and there's lots of documentation in terms of how this works. But what this template allows me to do is format a message the way that it expects using variable names. So if I were to put in this, what it's effectively doing is saying, and this is going to be JSON, this is going to format as JSON. So it's going to have some key value pairs up here, but we're going to say the title is going to be audit, and then we're going to put in the payload message, which is this value here. And then we're going to say the text of it says user, payload.admin name, modified site, payload.site name, and then I'm going to reiterate the message. Okay. That's all this effectively does, is just we're taking those values that came in and we're formatting them. Now, if we had received the payload from the webhook in this format, I could just pass it straight to Teams and be done. But in this case, we have to do a little bit of manipulation. So we're going to do that. We're going to debug it again and send. And you'll notice now my debug, instead of having what I passed in, has this value that I've formatted it into. Now, once we get to there, we're going to make a post. So we should have an HTTP request, and we're going to call this one. And you'll forgive me, I'm going to cheat again because I don't have that URL memorized. And we're going to do a post, and we're going to return a JSON object. We're going to call this post to Teams. Okay. Now then, if we deploy this and we send, I should receive and you can see it says requesting. I should now have a message in Microsoft Teams. The current time is 9:30, and I received a 9:30 message. If I jump in here, I can actually see that in my Teams, I've received that message.
Okay, Jake, that was an awesome presentation, and it was kind of fun as I was watching through it because I just got through teaching a lot of that stuff the last few days myself with the CWIIP course. And this knowledge is just so important for the future people that work in this industry. And we're seeing a greater and greater demand for it all the time. And I don't think it's going to slow down. I think we're going to see it greatly expand in the coming decade. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, what tips could you give people who are just starting out and they say, hey, I'm not a programmer. I'm not even sure I want to become a programmer. How does someone get in there and do it some, work with it some, so they can find out whether it might be something that's more interesting to them?
Yeah, I think getting a good fundamental start to whatever programming language you pick is good. Finding a tool that you use at work or that you want to dig into more and kind of exploring like what those SDKs are. Like if you get into Postman, Postman and Node-RED are both primarily JavaScript based. That might send you down a path where JavaScript is the thing you should focus on. If you're looking at things like Ansible or Salt or those types of things at work, that might send you down the Python path. And so once you kind of figure out kind of what path you want to start down or what things are relevant to you, then find a good intro book for Python. I like Learn Python 3 the Hard Way. There's also Automate the Boring Stuff, which is I like that approach of like how to take the things that you're doing, like digging ditches, and how to make that a little easier. whether that's automating Excel or interacting with APIs to just speed up the things you do at work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. By the way, I'm a big fan of that book too that you mentioned, Learn Python 3 the Hard Way. And don't be afraid of the title if you're watching this, because it's not really any harder. It's just the title of the series, and that particular book is actually very, very good. The other thing is, interestingly, if you want to jump in, you start working with these things. The nice thing about Node-RED is, yeah, there is JavaScript in there, but as you demonstrated, you can do a lot without any JavaScript. And then even when you need the JavaScript, it's not like you're writing 500 lines of code usually. It's little snippets of JavaScript, and you can actually say, oh, I want some randomization here or something. So you can go out and do a quick search for how do I do random numbers in JavaScript, and you'll see code snippets, and you can paste them in and modify them. And that's a great way to get started.
Yeah, Node-RED is nice because it's you're building logic, and sometimes, here's the thing, I'm not a developer professionally. Like, I don't get paid to write large pieces of software, but you can definitely diagram out like what you want to happen. And in fact, in previous jobs, it was like I need an integration that does these things, and I would go mock it up and say, look, see here it works, and then we would hand it to a developer, and he's like, well, the right code for this particular thing is C#, or it's something that I don't know, and they would put that together, but I could hand them a thing that says, here's how to glue these pieces together, and then they could follow that as kind of a guideline in terms of what needed to happen. So it doesn't mean you have to write it all. You just have to kind of be able to point them in the right direction.
Exactly. It's definitely a great mock-up or modeling tool of the flow. And we think in the history of programming, we think of mock-up tools or prototyping tools as building interfaces for users. But in this case, we're building really architecture diagrams, you might say, that we're allowing people to see here's the flow of information, the sources of information, what needs to happen to it, where it's going to end up, the destination. All of that stuff is really good in the tool. And the nice thing is that, it runs on Windows, it runs on Mac, it runs on Linux, so you can get it up and running on whatever platform you're on and start using it.
Yep, I'm running mine in Docker on my laptop, and so it's real easy to get spun up, and yeah.
Of course, he would get fancy and use Docker. All right, well, Jake, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate you not only taking the time to build the presentation for us, but also taking the time for the Q&A and engaging the audience live. And so thanks so much, and appreciate all the work you do in the industry.
Thank you, Tom. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.